We're going to go on a journey that starts at the end of the peninsula at North Wharf there, down near where the tower is at the end of North Wharf, and we're going to go for a bit of a tour and a big loop around Melbourne through the inner areas of the ports and the southeastern suburban area of Melbourne, with a couple of excursions a little bit further afield. And what we're looking at is all the unusual things in Melbourne, the quirky things that people have forgotten about, the weird and wonderful bits of Melbourne that are past. This city has grown to be Australia's largest city as of the 22nd of April this year, and it's grown that way in a very short period of time. It's now a city of the Greater Melbourne area approaching 5 million people, certainly 3.5 million in the CBD itself. And we've got a lot of people here, and it started off from 7 people landing here not much more than 150 years ago. So it's something that's, that we need to consider what amazing things have happened along the way. We're going to do this in a virtual tour of Melbourne. Each one of the past and present 15 points of interest that we're going to visit, we're going to start from the arrival of those first 7 European settlers in 1835 to the present day, and we're going to do that following a virtual tour looking at those locations. We go past a lot of these places every day, and we don't take much notice of what they are. We just drive past them, we don't see them, we just see what the traffic's doing and that sort of thing. We're starting at our journey from that end of North Wharf in Melbourne's Docklands. There's several interesting things there. There's the old port control tower, which is used to control all the vessels coming into the harbour, because the main harbour area, of course, was along the riverbanks of north and south banks of the Yarra, right up to the Queen Street Bridge. And the lower bridges, Spencer Street and King Street, didn't exist until late in the 20th century. Right at the end of the harbour, there are 2 steel pylons of the Balti Bridge. Those the ones that stick right up in the air, they're only architectural. They're hollow inside. There's a staircase that goes up inside them. There's a platform at the top. If you know the right people, you can get up there and get some absolutely fantastic photographs. I haven't managed to wangle myself up there, but I know a couple of people who have. It's also the home of the heritage fleet, the Enterprise and the steam tug Wattle and the Alma-Dopal. We're also at the junction of 3 major Melbourne waterways, the Yarra River, the Coode Canal and Victoria Dock. Now the Yarra River we all know, Victoria Dock now is the centre of Docklands, but the Coode Canal is not known to all of us. Some of the boaty types know what it is, but basically the river from that point down to where it meets the Maribyrnong River is not the Yarra, even though people want to restore its riverbanks to its pre-Aboriginal area and everything. It's actually a canal, and at this time it was built not long after the Suez Canal, and it is one of the world's larger canals that was built in that era. Certainly it doesn't rank as far as length goes with the Suez or the Panama Canal, but it was built in the same era with the same kind of equipment, and that's and it was built for a reason, because what happened in 1853, in 1852 and 1853, the gold was discovered at Ballarat, and all of a sudden Melbourne, instead of being a little backwater of the empire, became a major destination of the empire, and people started to pour in. At one stage they were getting up to 6,000 people a week arriving in Melbourne, which had only been going for a short period of time. It was less than 40 years old at the time when the gold rush started. In fact, it was about 30 years old. And the tiny town of Melbourne took off like a rocket. But the cunning burghers of Melbourne kept secret the discovery of gold for nearly 2 years. They didn't announce it to the world, didn't go rushing off to the goldfields, because there was a bill in front of the Parliament called the Separation Bill in London, and that was to separate Victoria, was the Australian Colonies Bill, to split the colony up into several states. At that time mainly, we were talking Victoria, Tasmania and New South Wales. And they kept it very quiet because they didn't want the people from New South Wales to find out about it, because they might have stood in the way or tried to stand in the way of this separation bill. So it was the best kept secret. And finally the separation bill was passed in August of 1850, and everything was all systems go. And immediately the announcement was less than a month later of the world's best kept secret, the discovery of gold at Clunes near Ballarat, and the Victorian gold rush began. And the tiny town of Melbourne just took off like a rocket. People, supplies and ships rolled in and the port couldn't cope. The ships up to that time used to come to the mouth of the Yarra, they were sailing ships of course, and they would be literally towed up by rowboats, or they'd be hauled up by the anchor, being thrown out and then winched back in, thrown out, winched back in, and hauled up to... sometimes they could sail part of the way up if they had the wind from the right direction, but these ships could really only travel with the wind and at a small angle to the wind. So they couldn't sail up the river. So getting from the mouth of the river up to where the wharves were and the town was very difficult. It was all right when you only had a few people coming, but when you started getting thousands of people arriving and all the supplies and everything else, it became impossible. So the good burghers of Melbourne decided to solve the Lower Yarra problem. And they started in the 1870s, they created the Melbourne Harbour Trust, and the first job of the Harbour Trust was to solve the problem of getting goods and services up to Melbourne. And they had already decided to build a deep water jetty called Station Pier down in Melbourne. And they built a railway line to run from, the first railway line in Australia, to run from the city, from Flinders Street, down across the river on a bridge that still stands in the Yarra, the Sandridge Bridge. It's now a walking bridge, and down to the area that's now Port Melbourne. Back then it was just sand dunes. And they built, to solve this problem, they built a jetty there. But they also found that didn't solve the problem particularly at all, because the difficulty of getting the goods from off the ship onto the jetty, onto a train, all the way up to Melbourne, dragged across the dunes, certainly made it easier, but the ships couldn't unload quickly enough, and they really wanted to bring them up closer to the city to unload, especially as they were building railways around Australia, and they had to bring all the coal in from elsewhere, because at that stage no coal had been discovered in Victoria. So they required to bring coal up to the railway lines in the city. So they created the Harbour Trust in the 1870s, and the Melbourne Harbour Trust was given the task to improve the river. And they hired a gentleman called Coode. He was a British engineer, John Coode, and brought him out to Australia. And this remit was to reduce Yarra flooding and to deliver cargo to Melbourne. And his solution was to dig a wide 6.7 metre deep canal, and river training arms at the mouth of the canal would be 6.7 metres deep and self-scouring through the tidal movement, so it wouldn't silt up. And to create a large dock, which is now Victoria Dock, and to construct the railway canal, which ran from the area that we're standing on at this point of North Wharf, due north up the river, what was the creek then that ran up Moonee Ponds Creek. And they created a canal up there so the ships could get up there and unload coal for the railway yards. So, and that's, if we look at our map that's up on the wall there. Now, at this point here, and I'll point to it, this is the area where we're talking about here. That's where we're standing. This area is all the canal. The old river used to go up around here and down again. It was shallow, winding. There was a big swamp up here, a lake, and there was a little creek up here and a bit of a lagoon. And Coode's job was to make it easier for the river to flow quicker so the water could get away quickly and, hang on, I have to watch my microphone, get away quickly and reduce the flooding, because the Yarra used to flood pretty heavily. And also part of this was to drain and reclaim a lot of the swamplands. It was very swampy around the river mouth area and the Port Melbourne, South Melbourne area, and still is there. They still have lots of low-lying land there, and that's been a problem for over the years of flooding in those areas. Right, okay. Now, in 1880, this 80-metre wide canal was Australia's largest construction project, and they bought in, at that time, an American Bucyrus steam shovel, which was the absolute state-of-the-art bit of equipment. And the one that they bought in had been used to complete the Suez Canal. And it was brought down here, and temporary rails were laid in the bottom of the canal that they were digging out. And it was a massive project to take the spoil away, and the spoil was taken across and used to fill in the swamps around South Melbourne and Port Melbourne. And the rest of the work was done with horse and drays. There was no trucks in that time, no motor vehicles. There was only trains and horse and cart. And the drays and men with shovels did most of the work. The walls were benched with rock to stop tidal scouring. And you can see on this one the rock being laid on the side. The other interesting points up there at the point where we're starting our adventure, as we can see the Westgate Bridge we've discussed before, but the whole of Victoria Dock was dug out at the same time, and it serviced Melbourne for 100 years until the Bolte Bridge opened in 1999, and the coming of containers a little bit earlier before that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The old port control tower was used to control the shipping. It was an architectural beauty in the time, in 1966. And that was built to replace an earlier tower that was built in 1934. It's got a lift, 2 decks, one for observation and radar, and other for amenities. It also had housed a phone service, providing shipping movements and, to the business and public, because people wanted to know when the ships were arriving, because they didn't have any way of talking to them. The businesses did. They couldn't get on the internet and find out when they were arriving. They needed to know when they had to organise the freight off the wharves and when the stock was going to be in the shops and so on. But the tower became redundant in less than 30 years, because over in America at that time, there's a little small trucking gentleman called Malcolm McLean in the mid-1950s wanted a standardised box system to easily move the freight between his trucks and rail cars that he owned in the Midwest of the US. And he hired a young engineer called Keith Tantlinger. Nobody's ever heard of Keith Tantlinger, but he's probably made more changes to what's happened in the world than almost anybody else in the shipping business anyway, or the transport business. Keith Tantlinger designed the locking system and created the dimensions of the modern shipping container. He had 2 sizes, 20 feet and 40 feet, and this was based on the length of the truck trailers that Malcolm McLean owned at the time, and the rail trucks. And it was the universal 8-corner twist lock and guide system. In other words, the 8 corners of a container have all got these little lock systems, and he designed that lock, and he designed it very cunningly, so when you lower the container, it had a point that it could slide over. It didn't have to be terribly accurate. You could drop it over it, and it self-guided itself and self-locked. And that was the beauty of it. They could easily drop one of these things with a crane onto a truck, and the truck could drive away. They didn't have to do anything much else to it. The container would lock itself on, and off they'd go. He also designed the door locking and sealing system and the structural integrity of the end frames to stack the containers 8 high on the wharves. And today, that design still stands and has barely been changed at all. They've changed the height on some of them, so they're no longer just 8 feet high. Some of them are a little bit higher than that. But that doesn't matter, because they can still universally stack them in the same way. It's just the stack will be a fraction higher. Of course, when containerisation came to Melbourne, the whole Victoria Dock became redundant. They built the new Swanson Dock just downstream from the Victoria Dock. But the Alma, and at our point of interest there at the top of the peninsula, the Heritage Fleet is moored, and that's 3 vessels primarily: the Wattle, the Alma Dopal, and the Enterprise. And we've got, we show the work that's been done to the Wattle, and the Alma can be seen in the photographs above. The Alma's almost ready to go in the water, and the Wattle's, what, 75th anniversary or something, is it? It's coming up? 90, yeah. So in our little trip, we travel from that area around the Yarra mouth there and the heritage boats. And the next thing we go to, we sort of head out of the docklands, and we're heading towards up King Street and La Trobe Street. And we come to our next point of interest, which is Melbourne's oldest house. There's only 7 properties that date back prior to the gold rush that are left in Melbourne. And one of them is this funny little house that's got scaffolding on the wall outside because on the corner of Latrobe Street and King Street. And it's had 2 families in it since it was built. The last owner lived in it until she was 101, and then it's been empty for about the last 8 years or so. And it was recently sold to a Chinese gentleman. It's got a heritage order on it. It's unlikely that it will ever get knocked down. But that heritage order of that house hopefully will protect it. It is just a tiny little 2-storey cottage, but it's what they built, those first settlers in Melbourne. The next point of interest we go to is the Yarra Falls. Now, people think, oh, the Yarra Falls are Dites Falls up at Abbotsford, but they're not. What was known as the Yarra Falls was a rock bar across the river, and you can see it in this photograph. That's a very important little item to the city of Melbourne because it was fresh water here and salt water below it. Below it's tidal and salt water, up here was fresh water. So when the first settlers came up, that's where they landed. I don't mean Batman, he just came and had a quick look. But John Faulkner's ship, the Enterprise, of which there's a replica down at the river mouth, at the place that we've been talking about, at Victoria Harbour there, it landed here, just in this area right there where those things are, and they built the first hut right there. And one of the gentlemen that was on that ship was a guy called Thomas Morgan, who happened to be my great-great-uncle. So our family has been here for most of the history of Melbourne. I'll say most of the European history of Melbourne. Now that rock bar was also where they built Queen's Bridge, because that was, and Queen's Bridge was the second bridge built across the Yarra. Princess Bridge was the first. It was ground zero for what was now a city, what's now a city of 5.8 million people. That photograph, by the way, is the oldest photograph taken of Melbourne, and it's taken from today from what's known as Banana Alley, looking across the river towards where the Crown Casino is. You can see 3 steam tugs in that photograph across behind the river bar. Those steam tugs were used even at that era in the 1850s for hauling the ships up the river. They were very early ships, and that was very high technology for the day. But they used to meet the ships down at the river mouth and drag them up. This was before the Coode Canal and the harbour was built. The wide area of the river you can see there is what's known as the turning basin. It's still there today, it hasn't changed, opposite the casino, and it's a natural formation. Now, the first settlers came up on the Enterprise, as I mentioned before, and there is a park on that area we saw in the slide before, which is Enterprise Park, and that's where the first European settlement was. The gentlemen on board were a gentleman by the name of Captain John Lacey. He was the captain of the Enterprise. He didn't stay on it to go home. He stayed on it coming one way and left his second command to take it back. Not a very big ship, and it had 12 people on it. It had, I believe, a cow, and a couple of horses, and a couple of sheep on board. And it had a guy called George Evans, who later became quite well known. He built a homestead called Emu Bottom, which is out and still exists. It's one of the oldest properties in Victoria. And up near, it's past out the back of Essendon Airport, up Sunbury way, yeah. And there was James and Mary Gilbert were a couple that were on board, the settlers. And there was another guy called Evan Evans, who later on, I think his son became quite well known in the canvas trade and flags and stuff like that later on, and grandson. And there was a pregnant lady, Mary Gilbert, who later, about 3 months later, gave birth to a child, the first child, European child born in Victoria, born in Melbourne rather. There had been an earlier settlement in Portland, and another one. Now, we'll talk about Thomas Morgan for a moment, being one of the original 7. One of the interesting things that happened with some of those people, you might remember there's a gentleman called Ned Kelly who was a bit popular at that stage, or unpopular, but notorious, I think probably is the best way of putting it. And when Ned was about to be hung, he'd been found guilty of murder of a couple of policemen and various other nasty things that he'd been involved with. He was regarded by a lot of people at the time as a populist sort of lovable rogue. If you weren't one of the people that was looking after the interests of the working man. And Thomas Morgan, one of the original 7, at that time was living in 27 William Street, Melbourne, and his nephew was my great-grandfather, and he used to visit him all the time when he was in Melbourne. He was sailing to and from Durham in the US, in the UK, out of Newcastle, and bringing coal to Australia, and he would stay with his uncle when he was in Melbourne. And when the petition for reprieve was sent around, they got 40,000 signatures. And the first signature on one page of it belonged to Richard Morgan. And this, you can see here, this is a page out of the original. And this was found, I might add, under the stage of the Athenaeum Theatre when it was renovated in the 1970s. Pages of the petition were found. And one of the workers on that happened to be doing the project for me. I was in the building business at the time. And he came across this thing and he brought it into the office. And we photocopied one, we returned it to the National Gallery, the National Library rather, State Library. And we photocopied the page though with my realised name on it. Okay, the next thing, when they were building the railway line down to the station pier to bring all this goods that had been arriving in Melbourne for the gold rush, they had to go over a creek, and they built the second railway bridge built in Australia, and that happens to be our old friend, the Montague Street Bridge. Now, the Montague Street Bridge is older than the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The current bridge was built in 1914, but the original one was built in 1854. It is a heritage listed bridge, and every second truck driver in Australia seems to be wanting to remodel that bridge. Now, I should probably exaggerate a little bit there, but there has been, since they started the website, the bridge has its own website. Since they started the website about 5 or 6 years ago, there's been 120 trucks that hit the bridge. Now, people keep on saying, the ABC at the moment is running a campaign on the mornings, a fairly ill-informed one, I might add, but they're running a campaign. Oh, we need to either raise it or lower it, or lower the road. Okay, there's a couple of problems. One, it's heritage listed. It is the oldest iron steel bridge in Australia and one of the oldest in the world. It is made of riveted steel plates. The second is that it actually does no damage to the rail line or the bridge or the public transport system. It only damages the trucks. In other words, the idiots that hit it are the only people that causes any damage to. It has height sensors. It has great big rubber straps hanging from a gantry about 25 metres back from it that you have to hit before you hit the bridge. So you've got to be blind, deaf, dumb and not concentrating on the phone to hit the bridge. The problem is, of course, that the human being that never looks up, because the accidents don't happen to humans from above, they happen to each side and from in front. Rarely does anything ever happen to somebody from falling out of the sky. So they don't tend to look up. Architects know that, and that's why they tell you not to waste your money on fancy ceiling tiles and things because nobody ever looks up and sees them anyway. You may as well just put plasterboard up in your house. It doesn't make any difference to the value. And and photographers will tell you the same thing. The people just look horizontally or to the sides. They don't look up there. Anyway, they keep running into the bridge. It's 110 years old. It was originally over a little creek. It was never intended to be a road bridge. Vehicles really didn't exist other than horse-drawn vehicles at that time, and they tended to be lower anyway, and horses. And there was no road there. When the bridge was built, it was just built over a swampy bit of creek, which was later filled in with the earth from the Coode Canal. And when they originally did it, they did the road a bit lower, but it kept on flooding all the time because it's virtually at sea level, at high tide it's at sea level. And so they can't lower the road down because it floods the entire time. There's no, people say, oh, you can put drains in, but pipes have to run downhill to get the water away. And they run downhill ultimately to the sea. And if you're at the same level as the sea, you can't run downhill, and they certainly can't run uphill. So that's why the Montague Bridge is where it is at the moment, and why nobody's terribly interested in doing anything about it. They can't raise the bridge easily either, because on the city side of the bridge is the tram depot. And actually, you'll note sometimes they park trams on the bridge. They use it as part of the tram depot, the South Melbourne tram depot. For them to raise the bridge, they'd have to raise the height of the entire tram system for that depot, plus the rails coming in from the various subsidiary roads, which is all set around the levels that are in that tram depot. So that's the story on the Montague Bridge. It was built that way so they could get the goods up from Sandridge Pier. And on our photo in this next slide, you can see the bridge right up at the top of the bridge, the one that's running across the river at an angle, is the old bridge that we're talking about. Took the railway line, not the Montague Bridge, but the one across the Yarra, took the railway line down to Sandridge. If we keep going along our area in Port Melbourne, not very far away from the Montague Street Bridge, we go down and we come across another interesting little nook and cranny of Melbourne, which is where Australian Motor Industries had their factory. Later on it became the Toyota factory and built Toyotas in Australia. But back in the just post-war days, a lot of interesting Australian motor vehicles were assembled out of kits, and quite a lot of the building work was done at a company called AMI located in Port Melbourne. And they were a large operation. They took 30 acres of land in Port Melbourne where they had a large factory set up on both sides of the road down there. And they assembled cars like TR3 sports cars and TR4s were down there. Standard Vanguards, some people might remember those, they're from the Standard Motor Company, and Talbots. Post-war and just pre-war, they were building those cars. Later on in the 1950s, they started building other English cars, the Triumph Mayflower, horrible thing. Ferguson tractors were built by AMI also in Australia, although they were designed in the UK. And they also built them they built them both at Port Melbourne and ultimately they started a separate tractor plant out at Sunshine, not far from where the Sunshine Harvester plant was. So we were, in those days, in the 1950s, quite a large motor industry before we started making Holdens, or we were just starting to make Holdens and Fords and some of the other cars. But later on, this plant was used to make Studebakers, to build Studebakers, to build Ramblers, to build, and for 10 years they built Mercedes-Benzes in Australia. If you happen to have one of those, what's called a Finney Mercedes-Benz of that era, from the late 1950s through to the 1960s, from the mid-1950s through to the 1960s, they were built in Australia, not Germany. And they were built, of course, with German components and German design, but they were built in Port Melbourne. And most of the Benzes in that era were, in fact, built in Port Melbourne. Not something that even some of the people in the Mercedes-Benz Club remember very well, but that's what happened. Other sort of interesting thing that happened down that area in the river was the Straitsman disaster. Now, the Straitsman disaster, a little bit of the history behind it was that they used to move cattle herds around Australia by droving, and they used to drove them along what were called stock routes. And stock routes used to finish at places like Port Melbourne, but they ran all over Australia and all over Victoria. But an interesting point that most people don't know is that they followed the Aboriginal trading routes. And most of the stock routes in Australia were even settled down at a very early age that they were open to everybody to move their cattle. And we've got a map here showing the travelling stock routes in southeast Australia, and they follow, and you'll actually notice that quite a few of them, if you look at it carefully, follow the highways too, that ultimately followed those routes. And they followed those routes because there was water, wells, and good grass, and relatively level land. There's one you can see here that follows the Darling River, another one follows the Murray. And coming down into Melbourne, they come across the dividing range and virtually follow the rivers down that run through to the Yanyeen Reservoir area and down through there, and roughly along where the Hume Highway runs. And the reason that Hume and Hobble came down that way was that they were following the traditional Aboriginal tracks with Aboriginal guides at the time. So the last travelling stock route, as they were called, TSRs, the last use of it in the city was when a herd of sheep were driven down Swanston Street from near the City Square site and across Princes Bridge by a group of Melbourne University students in 1970 who had found out that it was still the designated travelling stock route. And why did they do this? Because they could. And they weren't prosecuted. So anyway, one of these stock routes finished down at Port Melbourne. But the only live sheep trade and cattle trade, particularly sheep trade, that was happening at that time was in and out of Melbourne to Flinders and King Island and also to Tasmania, but primarily to the islands in Bass Strait. And King Island was famous for its cheese and the cattle trade was quite strong there and the sheep trade. And they used to use a vessel called the Straitsman to pick up these. It was a roll-on, roll-off type vessel where the livestock could be brought on board. They'd be driven down the stock routes, down to the wharves and put on the ships. And by the time the 1970s were around, of course, they were being trucked rather than driven down through Port Melbourne and Flemington. But they used to be taken over to the other side of the bridge, the river, and put on the vessel which used to berth just south of where Montague St Bridge is now, where the housing development is there. One day the Straitsman was coming up the river, and one of the crewmen was anxious to get off the boat quickly when they got there and go and see his girlfriend or whatever. And he started to unlock the stern door because it was calm in the river. They used to do this all the time. Well, not quite all the time. They weren't supposed to, but they did. But at this time, they were building the Swanston dock and for the container port. And they had changed the channel slightly and tightened up the corner. And the boat went round the corner at about 8 knots. About 6 knots, and the stern door part opened, and as the boat heeled as it went round the corner, a few of the sheep must have been standing on the wrong side, the water started to pour in through the part open door, and the moment the water started to pour in, within seconds, millions, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water had just poured in, and the boat rolled over. And it sank it rolled on its side, it sank in less than 2 minutes, and it was completely, at high tide, it was completely submerged. At low tide, it was sticking out of the water a bit. Several hundred sheep and 2 men were drowned, and one man was trapped inside it for 6 hours until they could hear him tapping on the inside of the hull until they were finally able to get in and rescue him. And he was asked by a reporter the following day, or a little later on, about whether he'd gone back to sea or what it had been like if spending in the dark and wet up to his neck in water in the boat, and did he ever go back to sea again? He said, "Oh yeah, went back next week and started going out to sea ever since." They then brought up the Straitsman from the river. They salvaged it, and it was repaired in Launceston, and it was later on used to ferry cargo across the Straits in New Zealand, and then ultimately ended up in Fiji doing trips around the islands, taking freight to and from the islands, and was caught in a cyclone in Fiji and was washed up on one of the reefs and wrecked. But it had a long life after it was raised from the river and went on for another 15 years or so, travelling around New Zealand and the Pacific. Down at Fisherman's Bend, there's another interesting thing that a lot of people don't know exists. There used to be an airfield down there, and it was a big airfield too, not just a little one. It was built during, just prior to World War II. It was built because the government aircraft factories were built down there as well at the same time to build aircraft, and they were building aircraft flat out in there before as they could see the war starting to happen in Europe, and the people rumbling going on a bit like it is now, and some of that sort of thing. So they started rearming, and they started building aircraft down there. And they built a big factory down there, and they built an airfield. And that airfield was used through the 1930s, 40s, and well into the 50s. They built Mustang fighters down there. They built a number of other Australian designed fighters. They also built the Lincoln Bomber down there, which the RAF had some of those. They were a modified Lancaster, but they were used after the war. And that was still operating in the 1950s. They also used to do car racing down there. It became quite famous as a car racing track. We didn't have Sandown Park and we didn't have Albert Park. Well, we did, but Albert Park was there at the time, but it wasn't being used for car races at that time. Later on in the 50s it was, but not in the early 50s. And the site was down near the river mouth. The runway, you can drive along today. And the main runway is now Todd Road. And if you drive down Todd Road, you're driving down the runway of the old airfield. And you'll see a railway line that runs alongside, or the remnants of a railway line. And that was put in there during World War II to bring the equipment and people down each day to man the factories down at, which are still there, at the bottom underneath the Westgate Bridge. The Boeing company now run the factory there, and it manufactures components mainly for the Boeing 787 airliners. It's manufactured the control surfaces for nearly every airliner that Boeing have built in the last 30 years. All the control surfaces, the tailplanes, the ailerons, the flaps, have all been built down there for 737, 747, 727s, and the 707 that was never built down there, but they specialise these days in composite components, and that's why they're supplying the 787 project, because it's an all composite airline and it's not built out of aluminium, it's built out of composite plastics. The car racing used to operate down there, and there was pretty famous car races down there in the 50s, and then later on they ran the drag strip down where Todd Road is now also, and that went on until the 1970s, the drag strip. And then in later years, redevelopment happened down there. The new engine plant was built for General Motors down there in the 60s, and the whole area changed again. But it was just swampy land that had been recovered with spoil from the Coode Canal used to fill up a lot of the holes and things there. And that airfield and the factories, behind the Boeing factory, there are still hangars there that are in use, large hangars that were part of the manufacturing operation for an assembly operation for the aircraft in World War II. They're still there, and they're still being used as part of the Boeing factory. Then we move along now down there. The suburbs were expanding in the 1850s. The population of Melbourne was about 23,000. By 1885, it was 260,000. And by Melbourne had grown to over 500,000 people by 1911. And in 1911, the inner city area was serviced by cable trams. And there was a huge cable tram network. It was the biggest in the world. It was larger than the one in San Francisco. But the suburbs were expanding so quickly, and cable trams were very expensive to install the tracks, because you had to dig trenches, and you had to have the long cables, and you had to have steam winding houses to haul the cables along, and so on. So a lot of advances had been made in electrical stuff, and in 1885 they put the first, 1885 was the first cable tram, and by 1900 it was the largest in the world. But by 1911 we had suburbs going out there, and the suburbs were out to Glen Huntly and Elstonwick. St Kilda had always been a beach town, and had been there for years. And so they bought electric trams in because they wanted to service. There was no cars, of course, and they were horse-drawn charabancs used to move people around, or they'd ride early bicycles, or they'd walk or ride horses. But the working person would just walk. So they put trams down streets like Glen Huntly Road. They put in Elstonwick were the first electric trams in Australia, and that was an outer suburb then. Now, when I started talking about doing this talk, one of the gentlemen who's in this room here on the other side of the camera said, "Oh, what about Williamstown Racecourse?" And I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. I can remember seeing the grandstand at Williamstown Racecourse when I was in the army in the 1960s, and we were practicing shooting at Williamstown Rifle Range, and you could look across and you could see the old grandstand in the distance. And I remember asking one of the old timers down there, "Oh, what the hell's that over there?" And he said, "Oh, it's a grandstand for an old racecourse." And the grandstand at that stage was still standing. It fire damaged, but it was still standing. You still recognise it as a grandstand. But in fact, it's the area that's now to the south side of the mouth of Koroit Creek, and it's now virtually, I won't call it a wasteland, it's being restored as a bird sanctuary and just wild coastal scrub and that sort of thing. And it is restored. It's right next to an AMSA migratory bird area a bit further south down at Altona, which you may or may not be aware, birds come from all over the world, from Russia as far as northern Russia, every year down to that area. And some of the area has been taken away for housing and other developments, and so they're using the area of the old racecourse to restore and put a wetland area in down there, and it's underway and it's moving slowly because money's short. But back in the day, the racecourse was built around the same time as Flemington, and it was as big as Flemington. The stand was as big. It held top races, the Underwood Stakes, which is now held at I think at Caulfield or Flemington. I'm not a racing man, so I don't know, but one of those is still going, and that used to be run at Williamstown. A lot of other Class 1 races were. Horses such as Far Lap ran there and won races there. It was a big-time race course. It's just gone. If you go there now, there's two bits of concrete sticking up out of the scrublands, and you can see nothing. But it was a huge exercise. And they built a railway line out to it. They had roads out to it at the time, but of course it predated cars up until the sort of 1920s. There were not very many private cars, so you had to have trains out to the race courses to bring the crowds out. And it was a very significant part of Melbourne. And now it's gone. It's just disappeared. The grandstand, you can see, was quite impressive. They housed troops in the grandstand during World War II, and at some time towards the end of World War II, a fire, it caught fire, the main grandstand, and was largely destroyed. And they never got around to rebuilding the racetrack and reopening it after World War II. The next map slide shows where it was and where it's now part of a coastal park, the Altona Coastal Park. There is a road down there called Racecourse Road that runs off Koroit Creek Road, and that will take you into that area. And that was the original road that went into the driveway. We're nearly at the end of this exercise, but another down in the same general area, but the other side of the river, is the Pink Lake. Now, some of you might remember the Pink Lake. I think the last time it was pink was in 2019. It was prior to COVID. It might have even been a couple of years prior to that. It's not pollution, like a lot of people sort of muttered at the time. It's an algae. It's a rare algae called the Danelia salina. It requires a very, very salty lake. And the only time the lake down there gets salty is in El Nino weather, where we get a very, very long dry spell. We have a dry spring. It's exactly the same weather that creates the bad bushfire seasons. It's required for the algae to grow. And because it needs a lot of salt. If we have a lot of rain, the water doesn't get salty enough in that lake. The lake next to it, that you can see in that photo, they're quite unique because the one that's the Pink Lake is a salt lake. The one that's only, in some places, only about 30 metres away from it is a freshwater lake. And they're natural lakes. They've been there, God, long before Westgate Bridge, long before the airport. They were actually inside the airport runways. The runways ran around two sides of them. They've been there since, Melbourne, well, I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands of years. But it's a natural phenomenon, and people come from all over the world to look at it. The trouble is they were coming from all over the world and finding it wasn't pink. And that created, they've had to put a whole heap of signs up explaining why it's pink some of the year and not other times. This, at the moment, it isn't pink. Now, just going down a little bit further south along the coast there, we can go down to Albert Park there, and there's the Kerford Road Pier, and there's a great big wide avenue, Kerford Road, leading down to the pier. And if you cut across that, it becomes Albert Road, which is not very far from where we are right now. I can see Albert Road out the windows. That road was built so that they could march 12 abreast down it with cannon and with horses and ammunition from Victoria Barracks to the Albert Park Gun Battery. And the gun battery was built where the Kerford Road Pier now stands, and where the Albert Park Yachting and Angling Club, not the Yacht Club, but the Yachting and Angling Club on the beach there now stands. And it was the 68-pounder guns. They were muzzle loading guns. They had a 2,000-yard range. And by having them at Williamstown, on the point at Williamstown, they had another fort, and the fort at Albert Park would be able to stop any vessel coming into Melbourne in a crossfire, because they overlapped. The range only overlapped by about 100 metres, but it did overlap from both forts, so the whole of the area in between could be covered by gunfire. Britain was at war with Russia in those years, in 1852 to 1856 in the Crimea, and because Melbourne was so rich in gold, there was a fear that Russia's Pacific Fleet would enter Port Phillip and hold gold-rich Melbourne to ransom. So that was why the batteries were built, why Victoria Barracks, which is still there in St Kilda Road, was built, and why those great big wide thoroughfares were built. Some of the other wide roads around Melbourne, I just touched on a little bit, and I didn't mention it, but when we were looking at the stock routes, there was a policy around Melbourne to build what they called three-chain roads. And the three-chain roads were so they could be used as stock routes. And they were major roads. One of the most was called the three-chain road for many years. That was the Murdoch Highway that runs down the middle of Mornington Peninsula. That was a stock route. And that was why it was called, it was 3 chains wide, and a chain being the length of a cricket pitch. It's an old surveyor's measure, and it's actually the length of a cricket pitch. So they were 3 times the length of a cricket pitch wide, and they were the stock route roads. And that was why they were so wide. But Kerford Road, no, it wasn't built for that reason. It was built so they could march X number of abreast, and so they would have some feed for the horses while they were doing it, because they had grass growing down the middle of it. The last little one that we're going to talk about today, and before we wrap this up, is another one, a bit of a ring-in, is Monash University. It used to be the O'Shea family's home and their trotting complex. Old George O'Shea was a very wealthy timber merchant, and he had built himself a comfortable mansion out at not far from where his city mill was in Oakley, and the rail siding that used to bring their timber down from Gippsland, from their mills in Gippsland. He built himself a nice property with a mansion house on it, stables, 2 training tracks he had out there. He had housing for his staff and farming paddocks to grow the hay to feed the horses. It was quite a setup he had down there. And one day in late 1950s, early 60s, the government came knocking on the door and ended up buying the entire property. And today it's the site of Monash University. It was built, it used to be nicknamed The Farm back in the day in the 1960s when I went there. And the ironic part of it was I was at university there with Barry O'Shea, who was the grandson of the gentleman who owned it, and is still a mate of mine. But it's just one of those things that you can see in that photograph. That would be taken around about 1960 of where the suburbs finished. The suburbs finished at Monash, and the rest of it was farmland out to the mountains. In fact, I can remember going down to our beach place shack at Mount Martha in the 1950s, and Warrigal Road was the boundary of the city. Everything outside the other side of Warrigal Road was farmland down to Gippsland. One side of the road was Burwood and those suburbs, and the rest of it, farmland. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed a few of these things and the things that are around our city, and there's many, many more of them, and I'm doing a series of these for a couple of clubs that I'm involved with, and I'm putting them together. Managed to get hold of a lot of historic photos out of the library, and we're probably about time to wrap it up, but that's a bit of Melbourne that most people don't think about very much as they drive past, but there's lots of places around town and lots of interesting things that have happened in the past that are worth having a think about occasionally. Thank you.